on this. All right, welcome everyone to the February IGRI research seminar. My name is Devor Mondam. I'm the coordinator for the IGRI, and our presenters for this month's research seminar are Tomás Olivier and Sechindra Vallury. Tomás is an assistant professor in the Public Administration and International Affairs Department at Syracuse University, and also an IGRI affiliate. His work focuses on the governance of shared natural resources, and he's particularly interested in how groups of actors collaborate to address collective action problems. And Sechindra is an assistant professor and director of the River Basin Center at the Odum School of Ecology at the University of Georgia. His research focuses on the management and allocation of shared natural resources, with an emphasis on how environmental policies shape resource and equity outcomes in coupled human-natural systems. And their presentation today is titled Institutional Fit and Policy Design in Nebraska's Natural Resources Districts. So I hand it off to you guys.
All right. Thank you, Devor. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on which part of the world you're in. Nice to see you all. Nice to see so many famous and faces of people I like. Note faces. I see that Sechindra joined us as well. I will be presenting on behalf of the two of us, and then the two of us will address your questions, comments, and concerns that you may have. I'm going to share my slides in a second. Kind of rusty with Zoom. Can you see my slideshow? Yeah, awesome. Great. All right, I'm going to get us started then. As I said, this is a manuscript in which my colleague Sechindra Vallury from the University of Georgia and myself have been working on for quite some time. We're still working on it. It's currently under review. And this is just to be completely transparent, to give you full contextual information to you all. We see this as a sort of like the first step in what we will hope will become a project where we can understand and analyze in a much deeper and broader way this dynamics of institutional design and institutional fit in the context of Nebraska. We see this just as our first approach to this case. We've titled this presentation Institutional Fit and Policy Design in Water Governance, the case of Nebraska's natural resources districts. Structured this presentation, in the form of a traditional presentation. I'm going to start talking about theoretical motivations. Then I will talk about the case of Nebraska's natural resources districts. We'll go over our data and our methods, show some results, include with some final thoughts and what we'll hope will be the next steps for this project in general. So as I started talking about and describing this paper is a paper about institutional fit and policy design. And the reason why we're framing it this way is because we see this question of institutional fit as ultimately a question of design, right? How can people design their governing arrangements, their policies, their policy outputs, so that they could address demand both social and ecological environments. So we see this as a nice way of bridging two traditions, two literatures that haven't interacted much with one another. When we talk about institutional fit, we basically refer to this notion that the effective management of natural resources requires governance systems that are aligned with their social and ecological attributes. And this is something that has been present in the literature on environmental governance, in the literature on common pool resources governance more specifically. We can think of Eleanor Ostrom's design principle number 2 that talks about the congruence between appropriation, provision rules, and local conditions as one of the important design principles for governance of common pool resources. And ever since, this notion of fit has kind of evolved and into a well-developed literature, I would argue, that has been further formalized with more precise definitions of fit and so on. But what we argue here is that most of this literature has paid a lot of attention to the relationship between fit and outcomes, environmental outcomes and governance outcomes, But there is a step prior to that that has to do with how does fit look like in practice, right? What are the outputs? How can we design outputs and to tackle or address local social ecological dynamics? And this point in particular, we see it as a point of contact between the literature on institutional fit and the literature on policy design, which at its core focuses around questions of policy tool selection and design of policy instruments. And there is, at its core, within this literature, there is a notion of how a policy fits its context. Traditionally, this literature has paid a lot of attention to context being defined as the political issue at hand and the existing policies at place, and it hasn't paid much attention to these other contextual variables. Within the policy design literature, there are authors who talk about what they call goodness of fit, which is nothing more but assessing how design features of a policy align with governance styles and other contextual factors. So these two literatures are kind of dealing with very similar topics, although highlighting different aspects of context, if you will. So, and we see that these streams of literature are quite related to one another, but have largely evolved in parallel. So this opportunity for us is kind of an interesting one to bring together the robust empirical and theoretical evidence that the empirical evidence and theoretical developments that we have from these two traditions, to engage them in some sort of conversations. So that leads us to ask, ultimately, okay, how do people in these governing arrangements design their policy outputs to fit to their social ecological environments? In other words, do we see variations in the policy levers that they have at hand when they face different social and ecological contexts? And we answer this question using data from the case of Nebraska's natural resources districts, which to us presents it's a very interesting case that suits itself to answer questions about institutional design and institutional fit. In the late 1960s, the state of Nebraska passed legislation that transformed or consolidated over 150 special purpose districts into 24 that were termed natural resources districts. These districts were originally tasked with overseeing groundwater regulation, and each district follows the contours of Nebraska's major river basins, under the assumption that by doing this, these districts could better tailor their actions to the local dynamics and local, what's going on in their particular contexts. What's interesting about these districts is that they are governed by a locally elected board of directors who have the responsibility for identifying and addressing issues dealing with soil erosion, water quality, forestry and management, water management, land use planning, among others. And NRDs have the power to issue and enforce groundwater regulations, develop and implement programs, and also they have the ability to collect property taxes to fund their district's operations. What's interesting about the case of Nebraska is that even though we have these special purposes districts that deal mainly with groundwater related issues and water management issues, the state retains authority to handle surface water issues. So there is a dichotomy happening there. For us, this is sort of an ideal case to address and to ask and try to answer questions about institutional fit, because not only we have currently, as of today, there are 23 of these districts, but also there is considerable variation across the state in terms of social ecological indicators. The western region of the state, for instance, is notably drier and has been facing extensive overappropriation of water resources for irrigation than the eastern part, for instance. At the same time, the state has been facing pressures from neighboring states for water conservation. The state of Nebraska is a signatory to several interstate compacts that require Nebraska to maintain certain quality and quantity standards regarding interstate river basins. So what's interesting to us is that these districts throughout the state of Nebraska have two main policy outputs, or two main levers that they can use to address their local conditions. One of these are what's called groundwater management rules and regulations, which are which apply to matters of groundwater quality, groundwater quantity, and the resolution and prevention of conflicts among users within a given NRD. And NRDs have been developing and implementing these rules and regulations since the 80s. More recently, since 2004 approximately, the state passed new legislation that requires NRDs that are located in what the state deems to be over-appropriated areas to develop, in collaboration with the state, an integrated management plan. An integrated management plan is just basically a framework through which the state and the NRDs and specific stakeholders are going to work together to address issues of water quality and water quantity, both at the surface and groundwater. Now, a basin or a sub-basin within an NRD is considered to be over-appropriated when current uses of hydrologically connected water resources are or will in the foreseeable future not be able to be satisfied by water supplies within that basin or sub-basin. So these districts are required by the state to develop these plans. Here we have a map of the state of Nebraska with the 23 districts. And the ones you see painted in a light blue color are districts that have basins or sub-basins deemed to be over-appropriated, and therefore that were required to develop these integrated management plans. Now, since 2010, however, the state updated regulations allowing districts to voluntarily develop these integrated management plans. So an NRD didn't have to have an over-appropriated basin for them to develop these plans. And as a result, we see that the remaining districts also went ahead and developed their own integrated management plans in collaboration with the state. And these are the ones painted green. So we do see that there is variation here in that some districts have been required to develop these plans and some districts have not. So what we're trying to do here in this manuscript is trying to assess, first of all, whether there is variation in the design of these rules and regulations and in these integrated management plans, and then whether, if there are variations, whether these variations are influenced by differences in social and ecological contexts of these districts. And to do so, we use two sources of two types of data, if you will. On one hand, we look at the content of these integrated management plans and the groundwater management rules and regulations for all 23 districts. And then on the other hand, we collected a bunch of data on social ecological indicators. Now, I recognize that this is not an exhaustive list of social and ecological variables for all NRDs. The reason we chose these indicators was mainly driven by availability of publicly, we were looking for publicly available data that was consistently present for all 23 NRDs. And also these variables gives us a sort of a sense of factors related to water supply and water demand within each NRD. So we looked at the size of these districts, the population within a district, the number of active groundwater permits in a district. So population and number of permits in a district gives us a sort of a sense on issues of water demand. Then we looked at average precipitation for each district, which will be a very rough take or assessment on water availability. And then we included an additional variable that is more, perhaps, if you will, institutional, that has to do with whether a district is mandated by the state to develop an integrated management plan. Now, before I move, and I wanted to show you, these are the maps of the state showing you that there is indeed variability across these variables throughout the state. So the map that you see on the top left, for instance, is the one that I showed you earlier with the districts that have a required plan versus districts that have a voluntarily developed one. Then we have variation, for instance, in the number of permits across districts. We have variations in terms of the size of the districts, population, and precipitation. So there are, this is also to showcase, that there is variability across these social, ecological, and institutional elements of these districts. Now, before I move on to the methods and how we went in order to code and analyze this data, I wanted to quickly address an issue here, and it is that in this paper, we didn't use IG. Now, I know that we are in a group that needs to talk mainly about IG-related research, but we decided not to use the institutional grammar, at least for this version of the paper, for a couple of reasons. First, we tried, but we quickly realized that only the groundwater management rules and regulations were suited to be coded applying IG. The integrated management plans are more, loosey, if you will, and they rather establish a sort of a framework for the relationship between the state, the NRD, and key stakeholders. But we couldn't observe many traditional rules or norms or institutional statements, if you will. So that was one thing. If we had gone with coding the groundwater rules with IG, we would have been left with integrated management plans being analyzed with a different kind of approach. And that would have put us in a situation where we had our data coded in kind of two different languages. So for this first approach, what we try to do is to try to use the same consistent approach to analyze, at least for this first take, the content of these two types of documents. At the same time, there are 23 sets of groundwater rules and regulations. Each set of regulations is anywhere between 20 to 60 pages, and there's only two of us. So Sechindra and I, back when we started with this, we didn't have access or support to request help from students or other folks who could help us with the coding. So it became quickly that we were facing considerable constraints for us to code these rules and regulations. So instead, what we did is we decided to take a three-pronged approach that focused mainly on a sort of quantitative yet agnostic first take of the analysis of this data. We did topic modeling to identify emerging topics in the content of the integrated management plans and the groundwater rules. Then we used clustering analysis to identify emerging groupings of districts based on the content of their plans and rules. And then we did it the same, but to identify emerging groupings of districts based on their social, ecological, and institutional contexts. And then we use fuzzy set QCA, qualitative comparative analysis, to assess whether an NRD ended up in a particular grouping was influenced by their social and ecological contexts. So I'm going to show you some of the results and some of the things that we have found so far. These are the results of the topic modeling for the integrated management plans. So even though we did use we applied several robustness checks and approaches to identify an optimal number of topics, those approaches didn't give us any conclusive results. So we ended up going with just two topics because these two topics gave us a collection of words that made sense within the context of our case. And these two topics have to do, one of them with planning and decision-making. And here we encountered words that we associated as dealing with critical elements of these integrated management plans. Here we see the importance of emphasizing objectives for NRDs to safeguard existing groundwater and surface water use, the defining of procedures to monitor, for instance, changes in stream flows, and also the importance of highlighting and the importance of outreach to interact with other stakeholders in the process of designing the plans and also reviewing the plans as they evolve over time. And all of these three elements are evident in words or unigrams or bigrams like objectives, biennial review, collaborate, approve, and evaluate. The second topic, we associated with these words more with regulatory actions and controls to manage groundwater and surface water, such as implementing moratoriums on new groundwater uses or requiring flow meters to measure water usage accurately. because these plans emphasize issues of quality and quantity that to us were quite emphasized through the use of phrases or words such as nutrient, stream gauge, and monitoring network. So these are the two topics that we identified in the plans. And as you can see, there is variation in the extent to which these topics show up in the content of the 23 integrated management plans. We did the same thing with the groundwater rules and regulations. And this time, one of the topics dealt more with the measurement and allocation. And we see this of water, and we see this through the use of terms such as flow meters, permits, records, and maintenance. So for instance, there is an NRD there that stipulates that individuals planning to build a new well or replace an existing well that pumps more than 50 gallons per minute, they must obtain a permit. So all of these words we associated with those kinds of measurement and allocation of rights and permits. In addition, NRDs monitor the extraction of groundwater as demonstrated by words like acre inch, permits, and approve. And then the other topic deals more with issues that we associated with enforcement and penalties associated with violations to those rules about measurement and allocation, and also the identification of processes through which users can say, hey, there's a violation here. Here we see, or raise concerns or complaints. And here we see words such as inspect, violate, complaint, report. We see the roles of courts. And then we see actions such as reducing allocation or issuing cease and desist. These two topics also vary across the groundwater management rules and regulations for the 23 NRDs. So once we had these topics, we used cluster analysis to see if there were any emerging groupings of districts based on the extent to which their rules and plans showed more of one or the other topic. And here what we see is two main groupings of NRDs. And what's interesting is that, for instance, this cluster 1 includes all but one of the NRDs that have fully appropriated basins. They all appear in this cluster. Central Platte, this one over here in cluster 2, is the only district that doesn't have that has a state mandate that appears in the other cluster. So we're starting to see that these NRDs seem to be defining their rules and their plans in a sort of similar way where the mandate might seem to be playing a role. But in order to further assess that, we used qualitative comparative analysis to assess whether these contextual variables that we identified played a role on whether an NRD ended up in one of these clusters. And we chose cluster 1 in particular. So our model here, or our QCA approach, since we only had 23 observations, we went with QCA. And our outcome of interest is whether an NRD ends up in cluster 1 of these plans and rules, basically if they end up here. And we try to explain that as a function of the population, the size, the number of permits, precipitation, and whether or not the NRD has a mandate from the state. What we see here, these are the results from the QCA analysis. Basically, every one of these C1 or C2 or C3 or C4 are possible combinations or pathways through which a district might end up in that grouping. So for instance, combination 1 shows us that an NRD that has low membership or weak membership on population, weak membership or basically low number of permits and precipitation, and has a state mandate, there is a high chance that that district will end up in cluster 1. What we do see is that permits, precipitation, and mandate consistently show up across all 4 combination of attributes, which gives us an idea that these factors play a necessary but not sufficient role in explaining whether an NRD ends up there. So what became interesting to us is that the mandate, kept showing up. So we took another approach to further assess whether, these NRDs with a mandate were similar as well. So we did cluster analysis again this time, but this time we focused on the social and ecological factors. So the graph that you see on your left is the one that I showed you earlier, how the NRDs were grouped based on their topics in the rules and plans. And the ones that you see on your right now is how NRDs are grouped based on their social and ecological indicators. So here, for instance, what's interesting is that this cluster 2 here, this one right here, includes all NRDs with fully appropriated basins. In other words, all NRDs that have received a mandate from the state show up here. And cluster 1, on the other hand, includes all NRDs that have not been deemed to be fully appropriated. The only exception here is this one, Middle Niobrara here, that shows up in cluster 2. It is the only district that doesn't have a state mandate that is showing up along with the state mandate group. So what this is telling us, and just sort of to start wrapping things up, is that we find these results sort of interesting, and we think that these results can bring contributions to our understanding of institutional fit and policy design for a series of reasons. First of all, we see that, oh, I forgot one thing. I jumped ahead one thing. Another thing we did, man, we did so many things that I forgot. So once we had these two groupings of districts, or these two cluster analyses, we tried to assess whether there was overlap between these two cluster analyses. And here, what we have is a table that aggregates the results from the k-means clustering to try to identify groupings. So for instance, the NRDs that you see in this column are NRDs that appear in cluster 1 of the NRD attributes. So they appear here in this cluster, and they appear in cluster 2 of the plans and rules. They appear here. This other column, on the other hand, captures districts that appear in cluster 2 of the attributes and cluster 1 of the rules. So cluster 2 of the attributes and cluster 1 of the rules. And what's interesting now is that, first of all, these two groups can comprise 18 out of the 23 NRDs. And this one in particular, the one on your right, captures pretty much all of the ones that have a mandate from the state. So it seems to us that most NRDs with similar social ecological features tend to produce similar outputs in the form of integrated management plans and groundwater management rules and regulations. Of the 5 remaining that are not in this table, 4 NRDs have not received a mandate from the state, and there's 1 that has received a mandate that is kind of like on its own cluster or grouping alone. So this to us, and now, yes, I'm going to focus on sort of the conclusion and wrapping up, is for us, from an institutional fit perspective, these findings highlight the importance of context in shaping policy outputs. However, what we see is that these findings to us introduce an interesting nuance, which is that these broader institutional factors, in this particular case, the fact that the state is mandating an NRD to develop a plan, also seem to be playing a role. And it's something that we argue the literature on institutional fit has perhaps not paid sufficient attention, which is how these institutional factors might be affecting fit, if you will. From the policy side of things, our findings shed light onto how these other social and ecological factors might play a role on how as policy outputs are designed. Methodologically, we think that this is an interesting approach because we were able to leverage semi-automatic approaches to address issues of similarities in policy design in a quantitatively agnostic way. And this is sort of where we're at right now. In the future, some of the things that we would like to do is to indeed use IG, perhaps building a larger team of folks and collaborators so that we can at least analyze dynamics of institutional design at a finer scale, at least for the groundwater rules and regulations, and see if there are patterns emerging in there as well. And we would like to take advantage of and conduct a temporal analysis to understand how these design and outputs might, for instance, be diffusing over time. So in terms of next steps and where we would like to this project idea, in more general terms, we would like to go in the future, and if there's anyone interested in collaborating with us, please let us know, is that we acknowledge that institutional fit is not a one-time and one-shot opportunity, right? Policy design and the context of these districts can and do change over time. So we want to start taking more of that into consideration by exploring patterns of institutional change over time. This would mean taking a look at versions of the groundwater rules and regulations that have been in place and modified ever since the 80s, but also understanding how these rules and plans have influenced and changed over time, and to understand whether changes in social ecological contexts, such as variation in rainfall, for instance, plays a role in the design of these policy outputs. At the same time, there is a big thing here that we have not touched and that we would really like to address as part of a larger project, which is the political element here. These districts are run by a locally elected board. So these people are elected to be in those positions. And therefore, there's a potential that there are political factors there driving how or if an NRD decides to change their groundwater rules, if they decide to raise their taxes, or if they try to deregulate or reduce the sanctions for overuse of water resources. And that's something that we have not explored yet, and we would like to do in the future. And last but not least, the elephant in the room here is that in this manuscript, we have not talked at all about whether these NRDs that have similar designs are more or less successful, right? We have not made any claims about outcomes or environmental outcomes, but instead what we're doing is we're taking a step back from that and looking at the first, if you will, effect of change of institutional design, which is we're looking at the outputs. And once we can identify how and if these outputs are responding or changing based on variations in contextual features, then we would like to move forward and start looking at what traditionally studies of institutional fit have done, which is look at the outcomes, the environmental and social outcomes of the actions of these districts. So I'm going to leave it at that. I want to thank you all again for your time, attention, for being here. We both of us, Sechindra and I, look forward to your comments, questions, suggestions, and more importantly, if you're interested in working with us in the future as well. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Tommy, for your presentation. We'll open the floor now to any questions. Shuping, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. That's a really interesting presentation. I have two questions. First is, I remember when you talk about the rules and why you don't use IGRI, as you mentioned, the rules are kind of loosey in some way, and that's not traditional institutional statement. So I wonder if you see there's differences between voluntary the district design versus mandate, because my sense will be mandate institutions, they will have more requirements they need to follow. Maybe that is some difference. And second is, I wonder, since you know this case very well, I can tell you that a lot of analysis. So I wonder, do you know, or is there some data you can get to see? So when they develop those, when they elected to the board, when they discuss those plans, do they do they see a variation of their intent to design this policy as like a fit to the local social and ecological context? I think that's an important factor too. Like then you can connect with, as you said, the political features and anything else. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Shuping. I appreciate your comment. Sechindra, feel free to chime in as well. I'm going to give it a first stab, and then if you want, feel free to chime in. So first, yeah, with the rules, we were able to they're suited to be coded with the grammar, and in fact, we coded rules for 4 NRDs. We did see variation in the content in what these rules are paying attention to. With the plans, it was a little bit more challenging. That's where we didn't apply. The plans are the ones where we didn't apply the IG. And we do see some variation in design, but here's where I think of the plans. And here's where I think it's going to be interesting to take a deeper dive into the plans and the dynamics that led to the creation of those plans, because we know from the literature that there are certain factors that influence the design oftentimes of these plans, such as whether they hired similar consultants. Also, there is the effect of time. An NRD might learn from its neighboring NRD and therefore borrow or reuse some of the text from their neighbors. That's something that Sechindra and I did as well. We did some incipient analysis of text reuse for the plans. And we did see a little bit of overlap between some of the plans, which might give some insight to additional factors that might be driving the design of those plans, and why we think it would be interesting to continue looking at them. And ultimately, this is why we decided to just go for this first approach, first take at what we have, to just use topic modeling to see at a more general sense whether and there were variations and where more are likely to be those variations.
And I have a couple of quick additional points. So we did run, so on the plans, we ran a simple cosine similarity analysis just to see what the overlap or what the similarity in the text across these plans was. And I think if I remember right, our similarity coefficient was like 0.84 or 0.8 or something. That's extremely high, kind of suggesting that the text across these plans was largely similar and largely boilerplate. And the other thing I was going to say, you raise a really interesting point about intent, which is something that Tomás and I have talked about in the past, is that it's true that some of these NRDs create these plans as a mechanism to keep the Department of Natural Resources out of these systems, because they look at these documents as a reporting mechanism that prevents or creates a constraint for the state to then intervene or monitor or overlook, right? NRDs are, from my conversation with several folks at Nebraska, they kind of function as a little bit of a black box, depending on which district you belong to. And that goes back to Tomás's point about wanting to look at some of the other larger political or socio-political drivers of the functioning of these NRDs, which would consequently determine fit.
All right, Elizabeth, go ahead.
Thanks. I think there was someone else with their hand up before me. Am I cutting in line?
It was, but he is gone now. So no, go ahead.
Cool. Yeah. So this is awesome. And we should definitely get together and talk. I'm working on something that is actually very similar with Marty, who's on the call, and Aaron Delott. And we're trying to get at that institutional factors affecting fit or affecting design. So we have two cases that have a state mandate. They're very similar in social ecological context, and they're within the same state. So they have, and it's California, so they've mandated kind of water supply, climate sustainability planning. It's for surface water. And we see the mandate change at 3 different periods over time. So we are trying to capture some of that learning. And what we're playing with is we used the IG to extract, like, I think we did boundary information and choice rules about the institution, or I guess we used kind of like the broader rule types framework about the institution making the decisions. So like how you mentioned, there's a city council that, you know, might have authority over the decisions they make, or whatever that is, a board or something like that. And then we're looking at the policy outcomes, the plans that they make using topic modeling like you guys are. And so I feel like we're sort of spanning that like speaking two different languages thing too. And so, yeah, I was wondering when you guys were talking about using IG to code the rules, were those, could you just talk a little bit more about like what you were even trying to get at with like what specific rules? Like, was it the setup of a water utility or district? Or I'm not totally sure if Nebraska works the same way that I'm familiar with in other Western states. So yeah. And then I also dropped a comment in the chat too about water supply deliveries with interstate compacts. I was super fascinated when you brought that up, and I was immediately thinking about like the South Platte Basin. So
yeah, thanks Elizabeth. Thanks for your comments, your questions, and yes, I personally, I'm sure Sechindra as well would love to collaborate and talk about these things in detail, and perhaps think about future collaborations. So that being said, yes, so our main idea with IG coding was to create networks to see the overall setup of how these rules were assigning and distributing responsibilities across different actors, the NRDs, the state, the users, the courts, and just to see whether being in a different or having different contexts resulted in the creation of different networks of prescribed interactions. Now, for that, we originally coded 4 of the NRDs, rules and regulations, and we did find some differences, but not very many. So we were left wondering, maybe this is not the right approach, because again, these are all rules that deal mainly with issues of how to make sure that a farmer doesn't irrigate more than what they should, or how to make sure that they're not using specific chemicals, and so on and so forth, right? So it made it a little bit challenging for us to use that specific tool. And then we were left wondering, okay, if we do a more general, traditional, descriptive IG analysis of this, what should we look out for, right? We were at a point where we couldn't find any, and perhaps, and we need to think perhaps more carefully about this. We couldn't think of any theoretical justification for saying, okay, should we see more of these kinds of rules or more of these kinds of forms of designing a specific institutional statement? So, and that's why we were like, okay, maybe let's just take a step back and try to at least put these two things in the same language and see what we find, right? And that's what led us this topic modeling route. Now, with regards to your point and the comment that Juniper made as well, absolutely. We think that the interstate compacts played a huge role in whether the state is targeting certain NRDs and saying, hey, you're over-appropriated. And in fact, most of the NRDs that have over-appropriated basins or sub-basins are located within one of those interstate compact basin areas.
They're all on the western side of the state.
Right, they're all on the western side, right? So that definitely plays a role. But and this is perhaps a cop-out, but one of the things that we really want to do is just collect more qualitative data to see how that plays a role, interviewing these folks that were involved in these plans and these rules to get a better sense of what is the role of the state and what kind of pressure, if anything, the state is putting into the design of these plans. And then going to the issue, we are very aware that Colorado, for instance, has a very similar approach for dealing with groundwater. My understanding, however, is that in Colorado, not all of the districts are as well oiled up as in or oiled as in Nebraska. And I spoke with some folks there, and they were like, yeah, it's not as perhaps evolved or developed in Nebraska. But I spoke only with one person who worked on water issues in Colorado, so maybe we could find different information on that.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that I'm realizing now, hearing you explain more about the rules that you're coding, is like these districts are sort of like quasi-governmental entities that are like between the state and water utilities, and we're down at the water utility level. So we can look at a private utility versus a public utility, and that gives us some like reason to expect that different institutional designs might produce different plans because they have different incentives to do conservation or whatever. But yeah, I think this middle level is so important. And I really love the multi-level aspect of this and considering kind of the state mandates. So this gave me a lot to think about. Thank you.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Thank you for your comments.
Juan, go ahead.
Thank you, Tommy, for this presentation, and congratulations. It's very stimulating. So excuse me if maybe this question comes a little bit undercooked, but and I guess you partly address it in the first question, but I was thinking about policy diffusion when you were presenting the case. So I was thinking if maybe there would be an interesting way to see if there's one of these consuls or the decision makers that are producing these plans or policies that maybe is leading, I mean, the ones that are created, and maybe the other consuls are the ones that are adopting part of it. And maybe that's why you are seeing like these, like a lot of similarities. And I was thinking if you have considered like if there's something that can be happening there. You already mentioned that you're planning on going to, getting more qualitative data. I think that would be really interesting to see, and also because I guess it would be really interesting to see also what's driving the difference. I mean, if there's a lot of things that are similar between the actual plans and policies, so maybe the difference are linked to these contextual factors that you're trying to see. I don't know. I'm just thinking that there's a lot of. I mean that there might be something happening there if there's a lot of similarity in the way that again makes me think about how policy diffusion can be happening there. I don't know if you have considered that. And well, very interesting to see how these continue evolving. So congratulations.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thank you, Juan. I appreciate it. And yeah, you're right on the money. We believe that there is a diffusion effect happening in here. Right now, what we have is just a picture. I like to make this analogy all the time, but we only have the picture, and we would like to get the movie now of how these plans and rules have changed and evolved to get a better understanding of the timing and ordering in which these changes are happening. So yes, absolutely. We would definitely want to do that. And then I forgot the second part of your question, Juan.
No, I guess just mentioning that you already said that you are going to go for the qualitative data because it would be really interesting to also know what the decision makers are, how they view it when they are designing these policies, and how they think about the fit as well. So
yeah. Oh, awesome. Absolutely. Yes. And then the other thing I wanted to mention is that we believe that there is diffusion, but there's also learning, and that's something that we would like to disentangle, ideally, again, as part of a larger project. So if anyone wants to join us in this endeavor, we're welcome to take on new teammates.
Anyone with any other questions? No? All right, and then we will wrap things up here. Thank you, Tommy and Sechindra, for coming this month to present your work, and thank you to all of you for coming to listen and offer your questions and comments, and we will see you next month.
Awesome. Thank you all. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.